Today, we are going to talk a little bit about export controls and prohibited technology. What we are going to be talking about today is our goal is to give a general overview of export control regulations, how export controls apply in a university setting, and give you guys some resources and contacts for export control questions. And then Paul and Joe are going to be giving you an overview of the state's Prohibited Technology Directive. They're going to talk about that in a university setting and give you guys some resources and contacts regarding prohibited technology. But we're going to go ahead and launch into the export controls portion. Okay, so what are export controls? And export controls it's what we collectively refer to as all of the laws and regulations, because there's a whole bunch of different ones from different departments that are going to govern the transfer of controlled information, items, and technologies to foreign countries and/or foreign persons. The reason that these exist is because the US government wants to control certain information, certain items, certain technologies, and in some cases, certain services that are deemed to be critical to national security or to prevent terrorism or restrict exports of goods and technologies to US adversaries. They may be critical to the US economy and/or they may factor into foreign policy. So there are laws and regulations that are in place to govern these things. There are penalties for not complying. That can be anything from fines, you can lose funding, A&M could get a bad reputation, or individuals can even have to deal with jail time. So what is an export? An export is any item, commodity, technology, or software that is sent out of the US to a foreign destination. So this can be a physical shipment, you're sending it through the mail. It could be you traveling to a foreign country and taking your laptop with you or your cell phone with you. And it can also be electronic transmission. So sending software through the cloud or through email to a foreign country. And so that's an export. And then a deemed export is when someone is transferring export controlled technology or information to a foreign person in the US. And this can occur if they're on a tour of a laboratory or they send an email to someone. That person may be in the US, but if they're a foreign person, sending information through emails or even oral conversations could be considered a deemed export. And export control regulations apply to both exports and deemed exports. So what is subject to export controls? Every tangible item in the US is subject to US export controls, even things like the computer you're watching this on, the chair you're sitting in, the pen you're holding. It also applies to biological materials, chemicals, things like that. It also applies to intangibles, so specific technology or information and/or software that is related to controlled items. And so two things to know about this is that US origin items and technology are still subject to export controls, even if they're not currently in the US. So if you have an item that is its country of origin is the US and it is in Germany, and the person in Germany wants to send it to France, it is still subject to US export controls, and you would still need permission. Conceivably, you may still need permission from the US government to send that. And then a lot of times when we're talking to people, we get the comment, well, this is available worldwide, or I can buy this off Amazon. Just because something's available worldwide or something is readily available off of Amazon, it does not mean that US export control law doesn't apply to it. It still applies. Let's talk about who regulates export controls. It's going to be a lot of acronyms, so just hang in there. We're going to briefly touch on all of these different acronyms and what they stand for, what agencies they belong to, but just know that it is a lot of acronyms. Okay, the three main things or the three main departments that regulate export controls are going to be the Department of State, and they do that through the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, or the DDTC. Their regulations are called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or the ITAR, and the list of things they control is called the United States Munitions List, or USML. The Department of Commerce, through the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, their regulations are called the Export Administration Regulations, and their list of items is the Commerce Control List, or CCL. And then the third department that we're going to talk about, these are the top three. There are other entities that have some export control regulations, but these are the top three we're going to talk about, is the Department of Treasury. And through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, they are responsible for the embargoes and sanctions on restricted entities. And so their lists are going to be the denied persons list, or the unverified persons list. And it's lists of entities that the US cannot do business with, or have certain conditions that apply to doing business with them. So just what they do, the Department of State, their regulations are the ITAR, their list is the USML, and these are your military things. It's going to cover your military items, your defense articles, technologies with inherently military properties. It regulates goods and technology, but it also regulates services. So if you're providing services to foreign militaries, it also includes space-related technology, because rockets. And then it also is going to include technical data that is related to those articles and services. And if you are dealing with ITAR covered items, you're typically going to need to obtain a license from the US government before you can export anything. And that means like an actual export, or even a deemed export, so information to a foreign person in the US. And their policy is one of denial for certain countries. So just to keep that in mind. The Department of Commerce is where I spend the majority of my time. The BIS administers the EAR, and their list, the CCL, is going to be the things that are dual use items. So they are designed for commercial purposes, but they could have military applications, like civilian aircraft, computers, biological pathogens. And the CCL is going to cover goods, test equipment, materials, biologicals, associated software, and technology. All items specifically named on the list have something called an ECCN, an Export Controls Classification Number. If an item is not specifically listed on the CCL and not covered by something else like the ITAR, it's still going to be covered by the EAR, but it's at this low level of control called EAR 99. And if your item is controlled on the CCL, you may need to obtain an export license from the US government prior to exporting it, whether this is a good, software, or a technology. And then the Department of Treasury, or the OFAC, they are regulating the transfer of items and services to embargoed nations. They impose trade sanctions, embargoes, and their aim is controlling terrorism, drug trafficking, illicit activities, that sort of thing. They are economic sanctions, and their focus is on end user and end user country. Their lists are lists of specific people and things that we cannot do business with, and they prohibit payment or providing value to these countries. There are some places that have comprehensive embargoes on them: Iran, Syria, Cuba, North Korea, and regions of the Ukraine. Syria has a little asterisk because there's some potential lifting of sanctions against them, but it's still kind of being worked out there. And if you are going to try and do business with, for example, ship something to someone or provide a service to them, and they are on OFAC's list, you're going to need to obtain a license from the US government before you do so. For example, if you wanted to send someone in North Korea a coffee cup, you need, or you will need a license from OFAC. You'll need to talk to OFAC before you do that. So those were the three. So let's revisit what is an export. This is whenever an item, commodity, technology, or software is sent out of the US to a foreign destination. So this, like I said, it could be a physical shipment of the goods or items. It could be traveling or hand carrying controlled items, and it could be electronic or digital transmission of technology or software. And let's revisit what a deemed export is. This is release of controlled technology within the US to a foreign person. And deemed exports as a reminder, are regulated by the same export controls as the actual export out of the US. It's considered being an export to that person's home country or country of residence or citizenship. US citizens and permanent residents are not foreign persons. So talking about something with a US person in the US is not a deemed export. As a reminder, an example of a time when a deemed export could occur might be during a facility or a lab tour, if there's controlled information in it or items in it, or by discussing information on an export controlled project with someone from a foreign country. Okay, so why do we care? There are consequences of export control violations. There's severe criminal and civil noncompliance penalties, and it applies to individuals, meaning whoever does it is responsible for it. But also A&M could get in trouble for it too. And there's some hefty fines associated with it. There's prison time. You can lose your ability to ship anything out of the US. You can lose governmental funding, and that would be it's a pretty big deal. And the thing we like to stress is that it also includes personal liability. And so this is why our office is heavily involved in reviews for a lot of different areas in the university setting. And I will talk about those in more detail in a few slides. So what is not subject to export controls? Well, there are some exclusions involved. So research conducted at US universities is often exempt from US export controls through three different ways, either the fundamental research exclusion, the educational information exclusion, or the public information exclusion. Results from research that are exempted from one of those three exclusions are not subject to US export regulations. If you are conducting fundamental research, the release of technology or software relating to that fundamental research is not subject to export controls. If the technology is contained in an open or published patent application, it is not subject to US export control laws. Or if something is publicly available, so it's technology or software that is made available to the public without restrictions. So unlimited distribution at open conferences, seminars, or trade shows, release by instruction and a catalog course or a teaching lab. And so those are things that are not subject to export control regulations. So three definitions from what we just talked about. Fundamental research is basic and applied research in science and engineering, the results of which ordinarily are published and shared broadly within the scientific community. This is going to be distinguished from proprietary research or things that are confidential and not shared. So things that would be ordinarily restricted for proprietary or national security reasons, those do not apply in fundamental research. Educational content is going to be instructional content of curriculum for all students, including foreign nationals, that exist in general science, math, and engineering principles that are commonly taught through courses and associated teaching labs. They have to be listed in course catalogs. It doesn't apply to like capstones. And then public domain, and that is when something is publicly accessible through books, magazines, distributed media, websites, libraries, patents, patent applications, open conferences, seminars, trade shows. So that's what we're kind of talking about. So I'm going to go over it again. The fundamental research exclusion is research that plans to be published. It's going to be published and it's going to be shared broadly within the scientific community. There can be no restrictions on publications, no restrictions on participation of foreign nationals, and no specific national security controls on the research or the results. If your research meets those conditions, and then your research results are not subject to US export controls. And like I said before, the education information exclusion is going to apply to information that's commonly taught in catalog courses. This does not apply to research or design projects. The public information exclusion is things that are out in the public domain. Kind of already talked about that. So the exclusion that we see most regularly is going to be the fundamental research exclusion. And fundamental research exclusion can be lost / does not apply if there are any publication restrictions that are saying no, the granting agency is saying no, you can't publish. having something like a sponsor review time is acceptable. But if they're going to restrict what you can publish, then fundamental research exclusion does not apply. So, like I said, a delay in publication is okay. A restriction on publication is not. FRE can also be lost if there is any sort of restriction on individuals who can work on the project. So if a project is limited to US persons, or if foreign persons are not permitted to work on the project, then the fundamental research exclusion does not apply. And so how does this work with deemed exports? So unless the research qualifies for a fundamental research exclusion, a university's transfer of controlled technology to a foreign national may require an export license. So to have a foreign person working in your lab, if you're working with export controlled technology or export controlled things, or technology behind those things, I should say, it may require an export license, or it may be prohibited. So a couple of caveats on this is that these exclusions only apply to results and information, does not apply to the items themselves. If you are doing work and you have an export controlled camera in your lab, that camera, even if your research qualifies for fundamental research exclusion, that camera itself is still export controlled. And you can't just take it out of the US willy-nilly. You've got to talk to an export controls office first to get whatever license is needed to ship it if it needs to go somewhere. And it's good to keep in mind that fundamental research exclusion may not even apply to all the inputs of a project. It would only apply to the results. And so it's good to work very closely with your granting officer, your grant officer, your project administrator, our office, to make sure that the fundamental research exclusion does apply and what it applies to in your research. Okay, so what does this matter in the university setting? How does this apply? So does the research you do involve military weapons, defense, chemical, biological weapons, encryption technology, and software, space, or other dual use items? Are you doing research that may involve like a thermal camera or like biological like cells, like you're working with bacteria, certain bacteria or viruses? Does the research that you're doing involve collaboration with any foreign collaborators, including students? And are they here, or are they internationally located? Does your research involve transferring or shipping equipment, materials, or funding outside of the US? Does any part of your research take place out of the US? Are you traveling to Africa to do a field study? Are you traveling to France to do surveys? Does any part of your research involve receiving and using export controlled information or items provided by a third party? You're going to need to work with your contract person, with our office, to make sure that everything is acknowledged and secure there. Are there any contractual restrictions on publication or access to, or how you can get your results out there? Does your research involve any interaction with a sanctioned or embargoed country or prohibited parties? Do you want to go do surveys in North Korea? Do you have any reason to believe that the end user or the intended end use of the item or information you have violates any existing export controls? And that may be something that you would feel completely unprepared to answer, and you would want to work with an export controls office to make sure that you are addressing that appropriately. So let's give some specific examples for how this works in a university setting. So export controls impacts all international university activities and interactions here in the US and abroad. It's going to impact research projects involving controlled information or technology. So are you purchasing equipment or biologicals that are controlled on the USML or the CCL? Are the export control offices do reviews on specific commodity codes in AggieBuy and in Burst to identify export controlled purchases? Are you traveling overseas on university business? Are you going to an international conference? Are you doing field work? Are you leaving the country? An export control review is done on all international travel. We have specific questions that we need to answer. Are you shipping or are you hand carrying anything to a location outside of the US? If you're shipping or hand carrying something internationally, an export control review needs to be done of that item to make sure that no licenses are needed to take it with you. Are you handling controlled information and item or items? An export control review is completed on grants and contracts to identify and set up management plans and appropriate security for handling controlled information and on controlled items as well. Are you participating in research collaborations with foreign persons and entities? Export control reviews are done on disclosures. We screen foreign collaborators and institutions. Is your research space, are you having a visit or a tour by foreign persons? You may need export control review if you have before individuals can enter certain areas or view certain things, depending on what research is being conducted there or what kind of items are in that space. Are you providing services or anything of value to an embargoed or sanctioned country? Is your lab testing urine samples and you are getting samples from Cuba or Russia? Are you getting things from places that we may not be able to provide certain services to? And then are there grant clauses that potentially prohibit foreign persons or have publication restrictions? There's an export control review done on grants. So we touch a lot of areas on campus and a lot of very specific things that go along hand in hand with research. All right. So the things that we do are we are making sure that we're authorized to do the research, to handle the items, to do the work that we want to do. And so when our office or when an export control office reviews something, whether it's travel, shipment, foreign collaboration, an IRB permit because the person wants to go work in a foreign location. This is going to be done on a case-by-case basis to answer questions of who, what, where, for what use. And there's going to be likely one of the following outcomes. You're not subject to regulations. Woohoo, that's easy. It could be that no license is required. Also fine. You're like, hey, good to go. We reviewed it. You don't need a license to do this. There could be, okay, great. You want to send this thing to this country and it's controlled, but handily. We have a license exception that the regulations allow. You're going to use this. There's not going to be any issues. There could be a general license that allows something to happen. This is typically an OFAC thing to provide a service, like they can take a course here. And sometimes a specific license is going to be required. And that means that the Export Control Office is going to submit an application to the federal government to say, hey, we have this thing that needs to go to this place. Can we get a license to do this? It takes time, takes a lot of time right now, and it's not guaranteed to be granted. But if you go ahead and take that thing to that place without getting it, that's illegal. Don't do that. So that's what we are looking for when we're doing our export control reviews. So this kind of shows it in more detail. We are looking at the end user. What's the thing that you're sending? What's it being used for? Who is using it? We want to look at this from like a military standpoint, prohibited parties. Are there any plans to divert or transfer to another party? We're looking for red flags. We need to look at embargoes and sanctions. And like, where are you sending this thing? Are we able to do business with them? We do screenings on all the people that are associated in this process. And if there is someone that we can't do business with or that is on a specific list, we may need a license to send that thing to that person. And then two things that are specific to TAMU, or I guess A&M system, is that there are specific countries that are considered high risk or countries of concern. And so engagement and collaborations with them are considered high risk and they require greater levels of scrutiny. And additionally, in Texas, we have GA 48, which is hardening of state government, and there are further restrictions on things that we can do with certain places, certain people, certain countries. So those are all the things that we are looking at, and this is why we're doing an export control review. All right, so everything I just told you, I am with TAMU. So TAMU, TEAS, and AgriLife all work very closely together to serve the needs of the faculty, staff, and students because there's a lot of overlap between us. We understand that. We work very well together, and we typically follow the money. So if it's O2 funds being used for something, you're typically going to work with TAMU. If it's 28, you're typically going to work with TEAS. There's caveats, there's overlap. So we work very collaboratively together to get things done. But if you have specific questions, these are the three places that you would reach out for more information. And like I said, everything that I just presented is from a TAMU perspective, but I know TEAS and AgriLife operate similarly, and they are equally happy to answer questions. We are all eager to help and reach out and make life as easy as possible for you. So, all right, with that, I am handing it over to Paul and Joe to do some prohibited technology.
Howdy and good morning. I'm going to be leading off the presentation today with Joe Mancha. We're going to be providing an overview of the state's Prohibited Technology Directive and how that affects you at TAMU. Joe Mancha is the director here at IT Risk and Compliance at A&M, and I work under Joe as an associate director in IT Risk and Compliance. And so what is a prohibited technology? Well, basically, it's a ban on specific hardware and software. It originated from a governor's directive regarding TikTok that expanded over time to include additional software and hardware from specific companies. And as a public university of the state of Texas, we have to comply with the governor's directives and state laws. And generally, without an approved an exception, we can't purchase, install, or use those prohibited technologies. And where you may have questions about a specific technology, you can communicate that with your local IT personnel who may actually end up engaging Joe and I. And so first, just kind of start off with a timeline. So back in December of 2022, Governor Abbott issued a directive requiring all state agencies to ban TikTok from state-owned devices and networks due to national security concerns. Some of the concerns were about the vast amounts of data that may be harvested from users of TikTok. The governor's directive banned its officers and employees from downloading or using TikTok on any government-issued devices, including cell phones, laptops, tablets, desktop computers, and other devices capable of internet connectivity. Which is to be strictly enforced by an agency's IT department, which Texas A&M is considered a state agency. And then in February, the governor announced the statewide model security plan for state agencies to address vulnerabilities presented by the use of TikTok on software and other software on personal and state-issued devices. And that statewide model security plan had 5 different objectives in it. The first objective was to prohibit the download and use of prohibited technologies on state-issued devices. The second objective was to prohibit employees and contractors from conducting state business on prohibited technology-enabled personal devices. Objective 3 was to identify sensitive locations, meeting places, and personnel within an agency that could be exposed to prohibited technology-enabled personal devices. The fourth objective was to implement network-based restrictions to prevent the use of prohibited technologies on agency networks. And then the fifth objective was if there were any exceptions that were approved, then to coordinate that with Texas Department of Information Resources. See, then later in June of 2023 came some of the laws, like Chapter 620 in the Texas Government Code, the use of certain social media applications and services on government entity devices is prohibited. And then kind of in the background, well, since we're a state agency, Texas A&M University, we had to start complying with the government directives and laws and such. So in July of 2023, TAMU system issued its efforts to begin complying with the statewide model security plan. Then later in October, Texas A&M University Systems Covered Applications and Prohibited Technologies Plan Memorandum was issued, basically to implement any necessary administrative operation or technical security controls to prohibit the use or download of covered applications and prohibited technologies on all member-owned devices. Then in January, when DeepSeek was introduced to the world, the Chinese AI platform, the government also issued a ban prohibiting the use of artificial intelligence and social media apps affiliated with the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist parties, on government-issued devices. Then in April of this year, TAMU System Regulation 290106 covered applications and prohibited technologies resulted from that original Texas University Systems Covered Application and Prohibited Technologies Plan. And it has 4 parts in it that Joe's going to talk about later. And this is actually just the preamble to that regulation summary, or the regulation summary for that particular SAP from the system. Just wanted to have some sort of graphic in here. So what are the prohibited technologies? So, I mentioned certain software, certain hardware and such. Well, this is kind of the software slide. And this is taken directly from Texas Department of Information Resources website, which they update periodically. So far, from what we've seen, they've had their initial release of these software and hardware application and developers and such. They had their initial publication, and they've updated this once so far. So they haven't updated it very often, but they do update it periodically. And so, well, what are these companies or these software developers and such? Well, like Alipay is a digital wallet and online payment platform. Cam Scanner is used for scanning in images and such, and it's had associated security breaches and even malware associated with it. DeepSeek, an AI cloud service. Kaspersky is actually a Russian cybersecurity antivirus provider. Moomoo for online stock trading. QQ Wallet, mobile payments. Share a peer-to-peer file sharing and content streaming application, and the list goes on. But these are some of the applications and such that cannot be installed on state devices or even your personal device that may be used for state business. So now we have some of the hardware companies. Duha manufactures video surveillance equipment like cameras and such. Huawei telecommunications equipment, consumer electronics, electric vehicle autonomous driving systems, and rooftop solar power products. Hikvision video surveillance and business intelligence products. Hytera manufactures radio transceivers and radio systems. DJI, they're commonly known for the drones they manufacture. And then ZTE is a technology company that specializes in telecommunications equipment and such. And then we come to covered applications. There's only a few of those: Lemonade, RedNote, and TikTok. And all of these are basically social media related applications. But there's one other thing I need to talk about a little bit more, and that's the difference between covered applications and then the prohibited technology. So what's the difference? So the covered applications, as I mentioned, they're limited to certain social media applications and services such as TikTok, versus prohibited technologies, which is a more broad set of hardware and software products and services specified by the Texas Department of Information Resources. And they apply to both institution-owned devices and personally owned devices used for state business. Now, one thing at the bottom of each one of those slides, as far as the hardware and software vendors and such, was the tagline, or a subsidiary or affiliate. And so that's hard to tell who may be affiliated with any one of these companies or who may be a subsidiary of any one of these companies. Well, if you have a question like that, we've been told to not do due diligence on our own to try and determine that only OGC could determine that. So if you have a question about it, or your IT department has a question about a particular piece of hardware or software, is this a prohibited technology? You can reach out to us at it-security@tamu.edu, and then we'll play the middleman for you, liaising with OGC and sometimes also the Texas A&M University Systems Research Security Office, to try and get them to help determine whether or not that particular hardware or piece of software is indeed a subsidiary or affiliate, which covers it under that broad umbrella of prohibited technology, or narrow umbrella of prohibited technology. But anyway, kind of the main thing about that is don't try and do the due diligence on your own. OGC will have to make that determination for us, but we'll be the liaison for you.
So in our timeline, we ended with the mention of System Regulation 290106, and we'll be using that as basically the format for the rest of the presentation, right? So we'll talk about that. So the regulation synthesizes the previous requirements, including the governor's directives and Government Code 620. The regulation addresses 4 specific areas, and those areas are the administrative and technical requirements for managing university-owned devices and networks. The second section covers the administrative requirements for personal devices used to conduct state business. Third is the identification of sensitive locations, which includes physical and virtual meeting rooms. And the last piece is the exceptions process, right? So there are a limited number of use cases that may be eligible for exceptions that must be approved by the university president. What's the impact on university-owned devices and networks? So if you're using a university-owned device managed by technology services, the impact should be little to none. If you, however, have prohibited technology on your university-owned device, you need to discontinue use and coordinate with your local IT support to have it removed if it's an application, or have a determination made to see if your use case is eligible for an exception. Now, we've made some strides in the management of devices. We are now capable of monitoring compliance, and we are also required to have the ability to remotely wipe devices and uninstall software identified as prohibited technology. And we've also made some progress with limiting network communications for prohibited applications through the appropriate implementation of firewall rules and VPN configurations. For these last two bullets, I know that we're not at 100% for these items, but I will say that we are continuing to mature our processes and capabilities to improve our overall compliance and security posture. So what's the impact on personally owned devices? So this applies to both employees and contractors. You are not allowed to have prohibited technology on your personal device if you are also using it to conduct state business. If you cannot or will not remove prohibited technology on your personal device for whatever reason, and you have a need to conduct state business on a device, you'll need to coordinate with your supervisor and local IT support to determine if a device can be made available to you to conduct state business. On the last bullet, for purposes of this prohibition, using a device for multi-factor authentication, MFA, Duo, that is not considered conducting state business. If you have a personal device with prohibited technology, you are prohibited from connecting to university networks. The exception to that are public-facing technology like a public website. So, if you have a need for a designated space, physical or logical, to discuss confidential or internal use information of a sensitive nature that must be protected from unauthorized disclosure, Section 3 of the regulation addresses the requirements for sensitive areas. It is up to the information owner to designate that space, identify, catalog, and label the location, identify and catalog the data that requires the protection of a sensitive area, and implement administrative controls prohibiting personal devices with prohibited technology from entering those sensitive areas. This last requirement applies to employees, contractors, and visitors. So a little bit about procurement. The regulation does address the prohibition to procure any prohibited technologies. I know that AggieBuy has implemented some technical controls to detect purchase requests for prohibited technology. One of the challenges of identifying prohibited technologies, as Paul has mentioned, is the identification of subsidiaries or affiliates. DIR has not defined what that is, a subsidiary or affiliate. Our position at this point is that we're not searching for corporate structure information or affiliations for every purchased technology. We do, however, act when notified about a subsidiary or affiliate relationship, meaning we ask that you stop using prohibited technology and seek to determine if the use case is eligible for an exception. And as Paul mentioned again, if you're in doubt, please coordinate with your local IT support. So this is just a quick recap. And so in the interest of time, we'll just keep moving to the next slide. Precautions. So just some precautions. If you're going to engage in a project that will include a technology purchase and you're curious as to whether it may be prohibited technology, you can review DIR's website for their list. They do have the official list. And if you're concerned about a subsidiary or affiliate status, again, you can coordinate with your local IT support. If you have a student or grad student involved in the procurement of technology, you need to make sure that they're aware of the prohibited technology requirements. And finally, this last point is probably the biggest challenge with prohibited technologies. A technology that's not prohibited today may be prohibited in the future, and that can create a lot of grief. Companies are bought and sold, especially within technology, and the purchasing company could be on the DIR's prohibited list. So something to be aware of. And finally, on this last section on the exceptions process, there are limited use cases involving prohibited technologies that are eligible for exceptions. Covered applications are eligible for exceptions for law enforcement, public safety investigations, and developing or implementing information security measures. Prohibited technologies are eligible for the same three exceptions for covered applications, plus enforcement of system-owned intellectual property rights and research. So what's involved when submitting an exception request? So you'll need to contact the Office of the Chief Information Security Officer to request an exception. You'll need to provide some sort of detailed business justification for the technology. And exceptions are required to be submitted and approved by the university president, and exceptions are limited to 1 year. And this last bullet does say no exceptions are permitted for covered applications. And that's probably true for this audience, right? Unless you're law enforcement doing public safety investigations or are implementing or developing information security measures. So just a couple of things I'm going to point off on this slide, since some of it is repeated. So on the third bullet, all approved exceptions must be reported to Texas Department of Information Resources by the Office of the Chief Information Security Officer. Devices granted an exception should only be used for that specific use case and only on non-state or specifically designated separate networks. So if possible, cameras and microphones should also be disabled when they are not being used for their intended purposes. So more specifically, what do we need from you when requesting when you are requesting an exception? We will need from you a project description. We'll need also a justification for the use of prohibited technology. We want to know what comparative technologies were reviewed. We'll need to know why those comparative technologies did not meet your needs. And on top of that, in addition to that, we'll also need to have an approved technology and data management plan, which includes how you're going to use the prohibited technology as part of your overall project. We'll need to know what risk mitigation measures will be in place throughout the project. And of course, we can work with both your local IT support and you to kind of get that, make sure that we have the appropriate risk mitigation activities in place. And then that plan does need to be approved by the Chief Information Security Officer. So once we get all of that, then notifications will be sent to your dean, department head, and or vice president for administrative units, the vice president for research, and responsible conduct in research office. Once again, the ultimate approval is provided by the president, and they will be submitted to the Texas Department of Information Resources, and the exceptions are only good for 1 year. So the next two slides are more about resources, and I will let you review those at your convenience once we make them available to you. And and if you have any questions, after today, or you're needing to get some additional information regarding prohibited technologies, you can certainly contact us at it-security@tamu.edu.